been working in the Salesforce ecosystem now for 9 years. I've been a certified technical architect in Salesforce since 2012/13, depending on exactly when you count.
That's Stephen Herod, a managing director at Accenture who is responsible for their global Salesforce operations. My name is Josh Birk, and I'm a developer evangelist at Salesforce, and here on the Salesforce Developer Podcast, you will hear insights and stories from developers for developers. Today on the podcast, we talked to Stephen about some of the distinctions between being a developer and an architect and some of the roles that architects play in creating successful applications. And we started off by talking about how the term architect started to become more popular within the Salesforce ecosystem.
I think there's an element of Salesforce growing up. I mean, architects always loomed over me. You know, when I was working at an insurance company, I had a boss who would definitely have described himself as a software architect. He was ex-Sun Microsystems, and, you know, he taught me a lot about data modeling and the value of data modeling, and was very much that kind of thinker, and would have lots of esoteric conversations about ways of doing things and architectural conversations. But I got that role, you know, starting off in the company as a solution designer, and then really was identified, I think, by him and others as being someone who would be appropriate to be an architect on the basis of, you know, the way I talked and thought about things. In terms of its popularization now, I think there's always there's an ambition push that says that everyone wants to, you know, be the next thing up. So you see a lot of that just in terms of all kinds of job titles. You know, this is why I depreciate myself somewhat when I say I was the CTO of an organization. You know, I could say that I was a chief technology officer. Yeah, right, okay, but we had 19 employees, right? like we did, you know, in business-to-business messaging for you know, invoice presentation. Yes, I was a CTO. It's not quite the same thing as saying I'm a CTO of you know, a major corporation or something like that. So it's all relative. I think it's a case of doing the work. I mean, I wasn't called an architect until I, you know, got a business card that said IT architect, and someone else gave me the title. You know, I didn't call myself that until someone gave it to me.
Is it kind of like you can't give yourself a nickname?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so I want to pick up on a few of the themes from your previous presentations and blog posts. For instance, can you describe to me how architecture is like an onion?
I got to remember what I said now. Layer. Well, it was the quoting Shrek, because that was a heavy presentation, that one. So it's layers and layers and layers. I think there's a couple of formalized approaches to architecture that talk about the concept of perspectives. And, you know, an architecture is a general term, but you could look at things from, you know, an application architecture or systems architecture or an integration architecture. And like, there's all different perspectives you can look at it. Business architecture is a real thing, and how business areas work together. So there's lots of different angles on it. And obviously there's all sorts of different levels as well. You know, enterprise architecture is quite a different thing to a software application architecture. You know, some of the principles might be the same, but the forces at work are obviously quite different. So, you know, it's a many-layered thing, and sometimes the way to think about things is, if you've ever seen one of those like slide packs of the human body where, you know, there's 7 slides, and as you peel back each slide, you see a deeper and deeper into the person, then that's really a way to look at architecture from a layered perspective. That's an interesting way to do it, because it also gives you ways of thinking about problems that every time you do it, because this is one of the challenges I have with templates that you build. You know, I love templates, and then I use them and find, well, this one isn't quite focusing on the thing I need to say, right? Because it's coming at it from a slightly different perspective. And, you know, I don't want to just, you know, say redundant things. There's things I need to say, and the template isn't covering it, so I need to cover it from this perspective. Does that answer your question?
It does. And to kind of segue into that, it's you define a term, areas of responsibility in your talks. And so give me the elevator pitch on an area of responsibility, and how does that kind of fit into that layered concept of what an architecture is, or what an architect is?
Well, one thing that's really important about systems design is really around boundaries, right? And understanding where one thing ends and another thing begins. because what crosses over a boundary is really important, right? And not having clear boundaries and not having clear understanding of the information transfer between the two boundaries is a leading cause of confusion in solutions, right? So messy, noisy boundaries or boundaries that are inconsistent result in systems that are bug-ridden and unreliable. So when you talk about an area of concern, it's really that within my area that I've defined with its boundaries, I have control of the design and the understanding, and then I have a clear interface to another system. So for most Salesforce architects, their architecture begins and ends at the edge of the Salesforce APIs, and they design what they design within the Salesforce platform, and then they'll say to someone else, oh, well, you need to, use these APIs to communicate to me, and you need to give me your APIs and I'll communicate to you. And that's where things like, handing over your enterprise WSDL to a third party to have unfettered access to your Salesforce database for them to do anything they feel like at any point in time gives me the screaming heebies because that's a really, unclear system boundary.
Right.
And you've basically said, to the other party, well, you can do anything you like, anytime you like, and I'll just try and figure out what happened. And that's really terrifying, right? Particularly when they don't understand the unintended consequences of multi-object transactions, right? Where you've got different transactions for every object you touch. So, when I say areas, and an area is arbitrary, right? You just want it relative. So one thing I don't think that's popular enough in Salesforce is the concept within a Salesforce org of application boundaries within an org. Because that application means so many things in Salesforce.
Oh, yeah.
A collection of tabs is generally, the thing. And that's a UI concept. It's not actually a system structure.
Right.
So within a Salesforce org, you really have to think about applications as a, the collection of objects and automations and all those things are related to it. And then that leads into things like your application packaging and so on. So, it doesn't really matter your area. You just need to know what it was and know that you're working with it and have other parties who are engaging with you understand that where their boundaries begin and end.
Which I assume factors heavily into things like packaging and CI and, you have all of these rotating cogs that are sort of working together.
It does. And, that's where you get some confusion because, Salesforce is very S-object centric. Everything's off a table effectively. But, when you're all dealing with the account object, well, who owns that?
So that's uncanny because I was actually just thinking to myself, if it doesn't touch the account object, is it really a Salesforce application?
Well, yeah, it does. It doesn't. I mean, we drawing circles that basically say, here are your 3 custom objects, do what you like with them, but touch the case object at your peril.
At your peril, yeah.
And, you have to come through a governance approach and justify your existence for wanting to touch the case because, the 5 core objects in Salesforce are the most heavily trafficked freeways in Salesforce, and you've got to protect them, right?
Right. So let's talk distinctions about developer and architect. I'm going to throw the first one out there because I'm a fan of video games. I'm also a fan of beer. I'm not sure you had a very visual way of showing this. So if it doesn't translate, we'll go to another analogy. But how would you describe the difference between a developer and an architect as you would put it in beer terms?
Well, that slide says, that if a developer is one beer, then an architect must be a room full of beers, right? It's just more beer. And I'm like, no, it's not like that. It's not just more of something. It's a change in perspective. And an architect doesn't think of, beer as and then knowing about more beer. They say, well, beer is a mechanism for passing alcohol, and alcohol results in a sense of social relaxation. And I seek the sense of social relaxation. So what's the approach that I want to do given that? Oh, well, I might have a bourbon. So it's that's the kind of approach to it of, it's seeing past the thing and seeing what the intent was behind it and then finding out other ways to do it. The other analogy was the car, right? Which a mechanic see that 2 cars are completely different from their perspective. There's no parts that are the same. They don't even have the same fuel systems. But an architect will say, well, they carry 7 people and they go 600 kilometers or 400 miles for you Americans. So it's the same. It's basically the same thing, right? And that's the intent that you're sort of getting at behind the scenes for what what's the consequences of that choice? What things can I now do that I couldn't do before? What things have I limited my choices for by making that choice? And so on and so forth. So to me, it's very much a perspective change.
It sounds like it's a lot more or a lot less about the nouns and more about the functions in the nouns and how those functions interact with other nouns.
Yeah, it's the interactions of the system and the consequences of those choices that I think are very important, right? And that's one of the differences that comes up. I think the other thing that people forget, or some people are attracted to from the architect, and certainly, I remember working with a guy, I've worked with a few guys in my past who would have viewed being an architect as being the opportunity for them to basically beat anybody else over the head with their idea and dominate the conversation. But that, I think, is a lot less popular than it used to be. And now it's as much about persuasion, right? So the thing I've learned through experience is that it doesn't matter if you're right, because if you can't convince people of the consequences of your choice over another choice, and often a lot of what you chose to be right turn out to be wrong later because of a change in circumstances. And you can't cater for that. All you can say is that you made sure you covered yourself at the time the choices were made, that they were the appropriate choices. That's why they said, everything you do is wrong, just not yet.
So let's dig into a couple of those key points, because that whole, the idea of an architect being the guy who can kind of use the bully method to get a design done obviously feels like kind of the wrong path. How do you think an architect and a developer should be integrated into the same team? Like, what's a good positive relationship between the two roles?
Well, I've got a friend / acquaintance called John Eves who I quoted, and he's got a wonderful blog which talks about this. And really the joy, the purpose of an architect is a good architect should be with the team, right? And should be engaging with the team and allowing the team to work on the details and to understand the choices that the architect is suggesting and to provide feedback to those choices, right? And for the architect to engage and fold the developer's feedback and suggestions back into their overall design, because the developers know what actually happens when you call the method, right? They know the consequences of the choices that you're making and the behaviors that they're seeing. And they need to provide that information back to the architect. And the architect needs to weigh that up in the context of their decision making. I mean, an example I would give is that I worked somewhere where, my boss, who was an architect, would say, oh, you need to do all the class level diagrams for the developers, like actually naming all the classes, right? And showing the class diagrams of how it should work. And then the developer should just go write the code. And I was viewed like, that's insane. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to build an Eclipse rich client platform application. Susan does. She's the developer. Me doing that is a level of detail that I don't have the knowledge of and is difficult. What I need to tell her is, we want to keep these things separate from these things so that I can swap that out.
Mm-hmm.
And she responds with, well, okay, this is how you would do that in this thing. I would use this kind of, I think it was OSGI module approach, right? And I'd go, okay. And, we would pass on I would pass on the desires of what we were trying to achieve, and they would reply with how you would do it with that programming technology. And it was more of a symbiotic relationship, right? And one of constant communication. So that, to me, I think is the model for working.
Does Salesforce offer some unique challenges there, given the multi-tenancy, given some of the core aspects of the platform? Like, do you go to a developer and you're like, this is the design, these are the separations, this is kind of how we're going to modularize everything, and then the developer's like, that's great, except for governor limits?
I think everything you do in Salesforce is defined by what you can't do.
Right?
And the consequences of your choices. We were discussing the old, do I add fields to this object? Do I create a separate custom object? Or do I create a polymorphic object where basically I give fields to you and 10 fields to you and 10 fields to you, but it's all in one custom object called case extension.
Mm-hmm.
We were discussing that yesterday afternoon. And, I'm very much one who makes a decision, make a decision, right, in my head. Okay, what's the consequences of that? Okay, what's the consequences of that? What's the consequences of that? What's the consequences of that? Oh my God, we're going to have a huge problem. Okay, let's back up 3 steps and
Right.
take a different path and go down that path to see where we end up. And generally what you've now got is a series of trade-offs, and you have to make a choice over, given the circumstances and the nature of the problem, which trade-off is more or less appropriate, right? So yes, it is. And then you look at, with Salesforce, you have to look at what's controlled by the customer's licensing versus what's controlled by soft and hard limits. And you also, the added complexity is you have to take into account of what would other people think about this. So things like Salesforce health checks, who have particular feelings about how things should or shouldn't happen, will disagree with that choice, often without the context of the point of view that you were making that choice in. And so, you have to have the appropriate justifications as to why you went that way. So it is a very unique environment, and it's one in which you can often, you have 2 or 3 choices, and you have to make the one with the consequences. That's why I struggle very so much with the right answer. When people say, architecture isn't about the right answer, it's about the least worst answer. Because if you've got a problem with an unambiguous right answer, you've probably not got a very complicated problem.
Well, that's interesting, because it's like on one side, you're kind of going through this almost Doctor Strange going into the multiverse looking for, the right set of actions that's going to keep things successful and trust in the application over time. But then it also kind of sounds like as context changes, eventually something's going to go wrong. How do you balance it so that architecture is providing that level of success and trust, but also kind of realize that, as you say, your right answer is just one that's not wrong yet?
There is a certain element of it that's, I suppose, cover your ass in the sense of making sure your justifications are understood and documented, and the trade-offs were done. And there's a strong focus in enterprise architecture of making sure the decisions are recorded with the justification, and so that when they come into question later, that the justification is understood, and that they know that you made an informed decision at the point in time that you made it. I think there's 2 people. Well, Ruth Mallon on Twitter, who I've never met, but I only know from Twitter. She's a software engineering architect, and she publishes some stuff on her tweet stream that's great. And I think it was a Grady Booch quote, that's something like, architecture is the things that are hard to change in an application. And so anything that's difficult to change at a later date is architecture, which is why I'm often, I really don't care about a whole range of decisions, because I don't view those things as being difficult to change, right? Once we've made the choice on this approach to contact models, I don't really care about, a pick list, or the method name and all that, because it's not, no one ever failed a project because the method names are wrong. It's inconvenient, it's annoying, it's frustrating, but it's not going to result in a catastrophic failure, right? Which is what would happen if you try and use a single contact record for 7 or 8 different uses.
Right. Yeah. If you can't talk to your data, you can't get much done.
Yeah.
So through that process, how do you know when you've arrived to that least worst answer? Like, how do you know it's time to put down the pencil and stop designing?
Good question. I mean, I spent a good proportion of the first part of my career actually worrying, am I doing the right thing, and is this the right choice, right? And templates are a great way to give you that fear. You're looking at the template going, am I supposed to know what this is? Is this the right way to do it? I think for me, it's have you encountered all the parties who might have an influence over this problem, and have you elicited from them the major forces that matter to them, or the major challenges or restrictions that they have. And then on that basis, do I have enough information to make the choice based on the constraints that I know the choice has, right? So for instance, if I say I'm going to use platform events to send a message to an off-platform system, I need to know how many events I might send because of the limit on Comet D subscriptions, right, a 24-hour period. I need to know that the party on the other side has the ability to do a Comet D reception. I know that they need to have a firewall, or the ability to manipulate their firewall to allow potentially these connections. I know that they need the ability to deal with a JSON response. I need to know that they've got the basic capabilities. And I also need to know that there's budget allocated to that team to make those changes, right? And a willingness on their part to make the changes, because I am never surprised by, often a customer's middleware team is unwillingness to ever change their middleware, despite the strict purposes of middleware to be that layer, and for you to have to accommodate their particular ways of working. So those are the sorts of forces I would take into account before making the decision. And that way you might pick a suboptimal solution, like, call outs from Apex, and have to build your own retry compensation layer using batch jobs and various other approaches, because the party on the other side is said, nope, here's your SOAP interface and I'm not doing anything else. And that's a constraint that you have to document, right? Because you're never going to convince the other party to transition to real-time middleware, in the time frame and the considerations that you have for the project you're working on.
And that's our show. Now, before we go, I usually ask my guests what their favorite non-technical hobby is. And Stephen actually gave me a couple answers. Normally, I would kind of pick one of the two. But honestly, in this case, it sounded like somebody needed to get a little credit.
I've learned to embrace this. I still play video games. So I play Overwatch with my wife, and I have to comment that she carries me. So if you play Overwatch, if I'm playing Diva, she's usually Moira and keeping me alive. So if I've done well, then she's always done better. So nod out to Barb. Thank you for that. And yes, I build model aeroplanes, like scale model aeroplanes, which is something I used to do when I was a kid, and I've taken up now as an adult because it's doesn't involve me staring at a computer screen, and I find it peaceful and distracting.
So while I have you, if the sound of Stephen's voice seems a little familiar to you, it could be from his many presentations, his appearances at Dreamforce, or it might be from his own podcast, which I'd like to be able to give a shout out to.
Code Coverage, you can look it up on coverage.org and follow it on iTunes and Stitcher, with Matt Lacey, my friend down in Melbourne. It's an infrequent podcast. I think it's got two errors in the introduction. It's no longer a fortnightly podcast, and of course it's no longer about Salesforce One because the naming changed. So it's turned, whereas some people take podcasting professionally, we've very much turned it into a hobby. So we're lucky to get 3 or 4 episodes out a year at the rate we're going. But people seem to enjoy themselves, so, we while away at it.
If you'd like to listen to Matt and Stephen while away at it, we will put a link to that podcast in our episode notes. And if you would like to know more about this podcast, head on over to developer.salesforce.com/podcast, where you can hear old episodes and you'll have links to your favorite podcast services. Thanks for listening. A huge thanks to Stephen for a great conversation about the role of architects, and I will talk to you next week.